black billionaire gets humiliated as her husband throws a cake at her, all because she refused to pay his bill. The act shocked everyone around. But the real story behind this dramatic moment is even more unbelievable. Grace Morgan stepped into the expansive gallery hall, the click of her high heels echoing softly across the glossy marble floor. The room was a sea of glittering dresses and finely tailored suits. The fragrance of jasmine mingled with the subtle scent of expensive perfume, filling the air. This was her world, the elite social events, the charity galas, the business meetups. She moved gracefully through the crowd, exchanging polite smiles and nods with familiar faces, but beneath her composed exterior was a familiar ache, a sense of being seen only as a symbol, an extension of her family's wealth and legacy rather than as herself. Her father, Benjamin Morgan, was a finance mogul who had built a vast empire from the ground up, while her mother, Evelyn, was a prominent art collector. Grace inherited their sharp intellect and discerning eye, but also the heavy burden of their name. Every success she had in her investment career was often dismissed as the result of family connections, and every failure became a topic of public scrutiny, a potential embarrassment to the Morgan name. As she reached for a glass of champagne from a passing server, her gaze was drawn to a man standing across the room. Tall, with sharp features and a confident presence, he stood out like a beacon amidst the polished, pretentious crowd around him. Their eyes met, and he flashed her a mischievous, genuine smile that quickened her pulse. He was unlike the usual crowd at events like this, and that intrigued her even more. As he walked toward her with slow but purposeful steps, Grace felt the tension in her body begin to fade, replaced by a growing curiosity. This man did not belong to this world, and it was precisely his outsider quality that captivated her. "Grace Morgan," he said, his voice warm and deep with a hint of mischief, extending his hand toward her. "You're hard to miss in a crowd." Grace tilted her head slightly. "And you? Who are you to speak so confidently?" "Ethan," he smiled. "Ethan Parker, a humble architect trying to blend in at a fancy gala." Grace let out a laugh, the tension from the evening slowly melting away. His natural demeanor was a refreshing change from the rigid formalities she was so accustomed to. They spent the rest of the evening engrossed in conversation, discovering a shared passion for modern art and urban landscape. Ethan spoke animatedly about his work designing community spaces and revitalizing urban neighborhoods, and Grace found herself drawn into his vision. In the weeks that followed, Ethan became an integral part of her life. He was never intimidated by her success or her family's wealth, at least, that's how she perceived it. He made her laugh, listened to her frustrations about work, and treated her like a real person, not a brand. Before long, Grace realized she was falling in love with him, despite the cautious warnings from her friends and family. Sophia, her best friend, was the most vocal. "Grace, he's charming, sure, but something feels off. He seems too eager, like he's trying to prove something." Grace brushed off the concerns. "Not everyone wants to hurt me, Sophia. Maybe he just likes me for me." Her parents were more discreet but no less skeptical. At a dinner at their estate, her father asked Ethan a series of sharp questions about his career and background. His tone was polite but probing. Ethan answered smoothly, but Grace noticed the slight tension in his jaw afterward. "I'm not here to impress your father," Ethan said later, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder and smiling. "I'm here because of you." Despite the whispers in her ear, Grace remained enchanted by him. Ethan proposed less than a year after they met, and she said yes without hesitation. Their wedding was an extravagant affair held in the vast garden of her family's estate. Grace spared no expense to ensure every detail was flawless, while Ethan seemed more focused on the guest list, insisting on inviting influential figures he believed could help expand his business. On the surface, everything appeared perfect, but there were cracks that Grace chose to ignore throughout the wedding preparations. Ethan clashed with her over everything, from the menu selection to the seating arrangements. Every time she disagreed with his suggestion, he accused her of being controlling. It was her mother, Evelyn, who first voiced what Grace had been trying to suppress. "Grace, my dear," Evelyn said as they stood in the wedding room that morning, "are you truly sure about this? You don't have to do this if you're having second thoughts. Grace shook her head, gently patting her mother's hand to ease her concern. Mom, I'm just a little nervous. Ethan is a good man and he loves me. Her mother sighed, but said nothing more, her face becoming unreadable. The wedding was beautiful, and for a brief moment, Grace allowed herself to believe in the fairy tale as she stood beside Ethan, exchanging vows under a rose-covered arch. She pushed aside the lingering doubts in her mind, telling herself this was the opportunity to find happiness, a relationship built on love and mutual respect, or so she thought. As the wedding reception wound down and the guests began to leave, Grace noticed Ethan chatting animatedly with a group of men she didn't recognize. She overheard snippets of conversation enough to realize he was using the wedding as a way to network and convince potential investors to support his projects. Her chest tightened uncomfortably, but she told herself it was fine. That was his way of contributing, of showing that he could fit into her world. That evening, as they boarded the plane for their honeymoon, Ethan held her hand tightly, whispering promises of a future filled with love and adventure. Grace wanted to believe him, wanted to believe she had made the right choice. But as the plane took off, leaving behind the world she had known, a small voice in her head questioned whether she was flying toward happiness or disaster. Grace silenced that voice, determined to make her marriage work. After all, she thought, love is about compromise. But she had no idea how much she would have to compromise, or what the cost would be. Their honeymoon began in Paris, the city that had always held a special place in Grace's heart. She and Ethan strolled hand in hand, exploring the hidden corners of Montmartre, savoring exquisite French cuisine. It all felt like a dream. Ethan took care of her, affectionate and always charming. He made her laugh with his attempts at speaking French and listened intently as she shared childhood memories, including trips to Paris with her parents. In that moment, Grace believed the fairy tale was still intact. She convinced herself that her doubts were just pre-wedding jitters, amplified by the gossip surrounding them. Ethan loved her, and she was determined to make this marriage work. However, cracks began to show even before they had finished unpacking. On the second night in Paris, Grace chose a chic black dress and the high heels her mother had given her. She felt graceful and confident. When Ethan saw her, he smiled, but his words carried an undertone of something bitter. "You look amazing," he said, eyeing her from head to toe. "But don't you think that dress is a bit much? It might draw unwanted attention." Grace furrowed her brow, surprised. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his tone casual. "Nothing, you look great. I just don't want people to think you're trying too hard." It was a small comment, seemingly insignificant, but it lingered with her throughout the evening. She began to doubt her own outfit, wondering if she really had overdone it. Meanwhile, Ethan seemed completely at ease, chatting with the waitstaff and ordering for her without asking what she wanted. As the honeymoon neared its end, Grace began to notice a pattern. Ethan always had gentle remarks about her choices, clothes, makeup, even how she interacted with strangers. "You're too kind," he said one afternoon when she struck up a conversation with a shopkeeper. "Not everyone deserves your time." At first, she brushed it off as him protecting her, but the frequency of these comments increased. They weren't cruel, but their undercurrent of criticism made Grace feel like she was always falling short. When they returned home, real life began to seep back in. Grace threw herself into work, excited about a new project that could revolutionize her company's approach to sustainable investing. She shared the idea with Ethan over dinner, hoping he would be proud of her ambition. But instead, he dismissed her enthusiasm with a careless remark. "Sounds complicated," he said, barely looking up from his phone. "Aren't you tired of all the stress? I mean, you don't have to work, we're fine." His words stung. Grace loved her job. It was a part of who she was. She tried to explain this to Ethan, but he just waved it off, changing the subject to something trivial. That was the first time she felt a distance between them, a gap she couldn't bridge. In the months that followed, Ethan's true nature began to reveal itself. He started taking control of their finances, asserting that it was his responsibility as her husband. At first, Grace didn't pay much attention. She trusted him. But then she began noticing the small things. Unauthorized withdrawals from their joint account, expensive items he'd never mentioned. When she confronted him about it, he merely laughed. "Relax, Grace. I'm just investing. You'll thank me when it pays off," he said. She wanted to believe him, but the unease grew within her. The shopping sprees never stopped, and his explanations grew more vague. "It's business," he would say whenever she asked for clarification. "You wouldn't understand." Ethan also started creating distance between her and her family and friends. He would refuse dinner invitations from her parents, claiming that he didn't feel welcome. "They never liked me," he would say, planting seeds of doubt in her mind. "They think I'm not good enough for you." At first, Grace defended him, but deep down, she knew her parents' reservations weren't without reason. Her father was always polite but distant, and her mother's eyes would narrow whenever Ethan spoke about money. Nevertheless, Grace gradually grew apart from them, unwilling to face the discomfort their meetings caused. Her friendships suffered as well. Sophia, her closest friend, was the first to notice the change. "You've been distant lately," Sophia remarked one afternoon while they were having coffee. "Is everything okay with Ethan?" Grace hesitated, then forced a smile. "Everything's fine. He's just busy with work and so am I." Sophia didn't seem convinced. "Grace, you know I'm always here if you need to talk." Grace nodded, but she didn't take Sophia up on her offer. She told herself she didn't want to worry her friend, but the truth was more complicated. She didn't want to admit that everything wasn't as perfect as it appeared. As time passed, Ethan's behavior became increasingly controlling. He started criticizing the way she dressed, the people she interacted with, even the way she spoke in meetings. "You're too blunt," he said after she recounted a tense negotiation with a client. "People don't like that. It makes you come across as aggressive." The words hit her like a slap. Aggressive was a label she had fought her whole life to avoid, a stereotype often used to undermine successful Black women. She tried to ignore it, but it lingered, gnawing at her confidence. Weeks turned into months, and Grace began to feel like a stranger in her own life. She was still excelling at work, but those achievements felt hollow. At home, she tiptoed around, afraid to say or do anything that might trigger Ethan's criticism. Her once vibrant social life was now reduced to occasional texts and rare meetups, always at Ethan's discretion. The turning point came on a quiet Sunday morning. Grace was sorting through the mail when she discovered a bank statement for an account she didn't recognize. The balance was low, and the withdrawals were frequent. Ethan had been transferring money from their joint account to this one without informing her. Her heart raced as she confronted him, holding the statement, her hands trembling. Ethan didn't deny it. Instead, he blamed her. "I'm doing this for us," he said, his voice high-pitched. "You're too naive to understand how the world really works," he added. "I'm protecting our future." Grace felt something inside her break. She had allowed him to make all the decisions in their relationship, slowly eroding her autonomy and self-confidence. But in that moment, she realized that the man she had once loved was no longer the person she had known, if he had ever truly existed at all. Leaving wasn't easy. Ethan had woven himself into every aspect of her life, and she knew he wouldn't let go without a fight. Yet, a resolve began to take root inside her. She didn't know how or when, but one thing was certain, she could no longer live like this. Grace sat at her desk, her eyes skimming the financial reports in front of her, but the numbers were nothing but blurry shapes, devoid of meaning. Her mind wandered, thinking of Ethan, of the argument they just had, of the growing sense of insecurity that had taken over her life. She had always prided herself on her ability to focus, to separate work from her personal life, but lately, the walls she'd built in her mind seemed to be collapsing. At home, Ethan's behavior grew increasingly oppressive. The small, dismissive comments from before had evolved into outright criticisms. He no longer pretended to care about her career, dismissing her successes as mere luck or the result of family connections. Every conversation seemed to circle back to his dissatisfaction with the way she prioritized her work. "You're married now," he said coldly last night. "You should focus on us, not your job." Grace tried to explain that her work was a part of her identity, something that gave her purpose, but Ethan waved off her words as if they held no weight. It became a habit, Her thoughts, feelings, and needs no longer mattered. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Ethan began discussing their finances again. He insisted on managing the family budget, claiming it was the husband's responsibility. At first, Grace didn't object, trusting him to act in both of their best interests while she focused on her career. But over time, she began noticing irregularities. Ethan started making big purchases without consulting her. A new watch, expensive suits, even a luxury car that appeared in the garage without her knowledge. When she confronted him, he simply dismissed her concerns with vague explanations. "I'm investing in our future," he said with contempt. "You won't understand." Grace's unease grew as she uncovered more inconsistencies. Bank statements showed withdrawals she couldn't explain, and her personal savings seemed to be disappearing. One day, while sorting through the mail, she discovered a credit card statement under Ethan's name with a balance that made her stomach drop. He had maxed out the card on extravagant expenses, dinners, gifts, trips, none of which she had participated in. When she confronted him, Ethan's response was swift and cruel. He accused her of not trusting him and belittled her role as the woman of the house. His voice rose, each word cutting into her self-esteem like a knife. "You think you're better than me?" he spat. "You wouldn't have this life without your parents' money. You don't understand what real work is." Grace was stunned, unable to respond. She had always known Ethan could be harsh, but this time, it felt different. This time, it was cruel. She wanted to fight back, to remind him of her achievements and efforts, but the words caught in her throat. In truth, a part of her had started to believe what he was saying. Loneliness followed shortly after. Ethan found reasons to avoid visiting her family, claiming they didn't respect him. He discouraged her from attending social events, calling them a waste of time. When she had the chance to meet with friends, he would sulk or call her incessantly, demanding that she come home. Her best friend, Sophia, began to notice the changes in Grace. Concerned, she asked, "Grace, you're not yourself anymore," one rare afternoon when they met for coffee. "You used to shine, be confident. What's happened to you?" Grace forced a smile, brushing off Sophia's concern. "It's just work, it's been a bit stressful," she lied. Sophia didn't seem convinced, but she didn't push further. Still, her words echoed in Grace's mind, like a crack in the armor she had built around her, her marriage and her career. At work, Grace's performance began to slip. She missed deadlines, forgot important meetings, and couldn't seem to concentrate. Her colleagues noticed, but she dismissed their concern, attributing it to personal stress. She felt trapped, suffocated by Ethan's control and her own silence. The turning point came one afternoon when Grace came home early. She found Ethan in his office, hunched over his computer, completely unaware of her presence. As she approached, she saw the screen. A series of emails between Ethan and a luxury travel agency arranging a trip to the Maldives. Her name wasn't anywhere in sight. "Who's this trip for?" she asked, her voice calm, though a storm was brewing inside. Ethan startled, quickly slamming the laptop shut. His expression shifted from surprise to anger. "What are you doing? Why are you invading my privacy?" he shouted. Grace stood her ground. "I have a right to know how my husband is spending our money," she replied. Ethan sneered. "Don't even think about it, Grace. This is my money. I'm the one who's been worrying about keeping us afloat while you're busy playing at your job," he said, his words cutting deeper into Grace's heart than she expected. For years, Grace had fought against the stereotype that black women had to work twice as hard to be recognized. Yet now, Ethan dismissed her achievements so easily, a blow to everything she had fought for. The confrontation grew increasingly tense. Ethan accused her of being ungrateful and disrespectful before storming out, slamming the door behind him. Grace stood frozen in the empty hallway, her hands trembling, her mind spinning. At that moment, she realized how much of herself she had lost. She had allowed Ethan to diminish her self-confidence, isolate her from those who loved her, control every aspect of her life. And all for what? To keep the peace? To prove that this marriage was worth saving? That night, Grace lay wide awake, staring up at the ceiling. She thought of the woman she used to be, strong, independent, unafraid of challenges. She remembered her parents' lessons, how she had to value herself and never settle for less than what she deserved. She thought of Sophia, who had seen through her shell even when Grace refused to admit it. The next morning, a sense of resolve formed within Grace. She didn't know how, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't live like this anymore. Something had to change, and this time, she would be the one to take control. Grace adjusted her emerald green dress and took one last look at herself in the mirror. The reflection gazed back at her, calm yet far from peaceful. The dress was beautiful, a birthday gift from her mother, but tonight it felt like armor. She was determined to turn this evening into a turning point, a chance to salvage what was left of her marriage or face the truth she had been avoiding for too long. She had chosen one of the city's most upscale restaurants for the occasion, a place that required reservations months in advance, with dim lighting, impeccable service, and a menu worthy of the art adorning the walls. Grace hoped the elegant setting would soothe Ethan, encouraging him to let go of his hostility and allow for an honest conversation. When Ethan arrived, he was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that Grace hadn't seen before, clearly one of his recent acquisitions. He kissed her on the cheek, his smile reaching no farther than his lips. Grace couldn't help but notice Ethan's gaze linger on her dress, followed by a faint smirk. "You look expensive," he said, pulling out his chair. Grace forced a smile, brushing off the comment. "Thank you for coming tonight. I thought we could have a quiet evening together." Ethan nodded, signaling to the waiter without asking her opinion. "We've both been so busy lately. Maybe it's time we take a moment to talk." The waiter approached, and Ethan ordered an expensive bottle of wine without even glancing at the menu. Grace hesitated, but decided not to comment, letting him take the lead for the evening, at least for now. The conversation started with trivialities. Ethan spoke about his recent meetings with potential investors, mixed with subtle boasts about his connections. Grace listened politely, her mind drifting. His tone, the way he spoke about his success, it all felt rehearsed, as if he were performing for an audience that didn't exist. As the appetizer arrived, Ethan shifted his attention to Grace. "So, how's work? Still playing around with the company stuff?" Grace set her fork down, her stomach tightening. "It's tough but rewarding. We're launching a new project focused on sustainable investment. It's something I've been passionate about for a long time." Ethan shrugged, swirling his wine glass. "Sounds noble. But don't you get tired? All the stress, the long hours. I mean, you don't have to work. We're fine without it." Grace took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "My work isn't just about money, Ethan. It's about purpose. That's important to me." He leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Of course, you're always so ambitious. But hasn't it come time to focus on other things? Like building a family? You're not getting any younger, Grace." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting to the core. Grace felt her face flush, anger and embarrassment rising within her. She looked deep into his eyes, searching for any sign of remorse, but Ethan appeared completely at ease, as though he had just made a harmless remark. "I don't think my career and our future have to exclude each other," she said, her voice steady, fighting to maintain composure. Ethan waved his hand dismissively, as though brushing off her words. "You don't have to prove anything anymore," he said. "You've already achieved more than most people. Maybe it's time to slow down and enjoy life." Grace opened her mouth to respond, but the waiter arrived with the main course, interrupting her. The pause felt like a moment the universe had granted her to calm down. She looked down at the plate, the meal arranged so elegantly, almost mocking her. It was ironic, she thought, how everything around her could look so perfect, while her life was crumbling. Throughout the meal, Ethan dominated the conversation, recounting his successes in relationship building and his plans for an upcoming business trip. Grace nodded along, listening, but her mind raced. Every second that passed only reinforced the realization that their relationship was beyond saving. When the waiter brought the dessert menu, Grace decided to test her suspicion. She leaned back in her chair and fixed Ethan with a steady gaze. "Why don't you pay the bill tonight?" she said casually. "You've been so generous lately, Let me give you the chance to take care of it this time. Ethan froze, the fork hanging midair. For a brief moment, his polished facade cracked, revealing a flicker of irritation. He quickly regained his composure, laughing as though she had just made a joke. Grace, come on. Don't carry cash like that. Besides, you're the one who picked the place. Grace tilted her head, her voice calm yet firm. I think it would be nice if you treated me for once. Or are you saying you can't do that? The words hung in the air, heavier than anything that had been said that evening. Ethan's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with anger. What are you trying to prove? He snarled, struggling to contain himself, though his venom was unmistakable. Are you trying to pull this stunt here, in front of everyone? Grace didn't flinch. I'm not trying to prove anything, Ethan. I just think it's fair. Ethan's anger erupted. He slammed the fork down onto the table, drawing the attention of those seated nearby. His face flushed red, the carefully cultivated charm replaced by raw fury. Fair? He spat. You want to talk about fair? Everything I've done for you, for this marriage, and this is how you repay me? You think you're better than me just because of your father's money? You're pathetic. The room fell silent, all eyes on their table. Grace felt a wave of humiliation wash over her, but she refused to let him break her. She lifted her chin, her voice steady but resolute. This isn't about money, Ethan. It's about respect, and clearly, I'm not going to find that here. Ethan's face contorted in rage. Without warning, he grabbed the dessert plate in front of him, a delicately crafted chocolate tart, and hurled it straight at her. The plate shattered, the dessert splattering across her face and clothes. Gasps rippled through the room as people recoiled in shock. Grace sat stunned for a moment, the tart pieces slipping down her cheek, but then, slowly, she stood up. The shame she had felt moments before vanished, replaced by a calm, unyielding determination. She took a napkin and gently wiped her face. This is over, she said softly, her voice ringing out in the shocked silence around her. She turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind Ethan and the broken remnants of their relationship. As she stepped into the cool night air, a clear sense of liberation washed over her. For the first time in years, Grace felt truly free. It was time to take control of her life, and she knew exactly where to begin. The sound of Grace's footsteps echoed on. The marble floor of her parents' foyer, the sharp sound contrasting with the stillness in her mind. She gripped her purse tightly, the dress still smeared with the chocolate tart Ethan had thrown at her. The humiliation from the restaurant lingered, but beneath it was something far stronger, resolve. The double doors opened just before her hand reached the handle. Her mother, Evelyn, stood in the doorway, her sharp gaze sweeping over Grace from head to toe. Evelyn's face, usually serene and composed, softened with concern as she saw her daughter in such a disheveled state. Grace, Evelyn spoke, stepping aside to let her in. What happened? Grace didn't answer immediately. She walked past her mother into the spacious living room. The scent of lavender and polished wood filled the air. For the first time in a long while, Grace allowed herself to relax, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Her father, Benjamin, appeared at the top of the stairs, sleeves rolled up and a book in hand. Upon seeing Grace, he paused, descending quickly, his usual stern expression replaced with genuine worry. Grace, he said, his voice low but steady. Are you all right? Grace took a deep breath, her voice trembling. As she continued, No, Dad, I'm fine. Evelyn and Benjamin exchanged a glance before leading her into the living room. The space was familiar to Grace, like the reflection of her own self, plush upholstered chairs, the soft glow of the fireplace, and framed photographs capturing significant family moments. It was a room of safety, comfort, a stark contrast to the chaos she had just escaped. She recounted everything, her parents listening in silence. She didn't leave out a single detail, from Ethan's increasingly hostile attitude to the final explosive scene at the restaurant. When she finished, her hands trembled, and tears silently welled in her eyes. I don't understand how things got this bad, she said, her voice weak. I kept telling myself it would get better, that I just needed to try harder, but now I can't keep going. I'm done. Evelyn placed a steady hand over Grace's, the firmness of her mother's gesture offering a sense of support. "You don't have to do this alone, Grace," Evelyn said softly. "We're always here for you, whatever you need." Benjamin nodded, his jaw clenched with rage. "You've endured too much," he said, his voice filled with anger. "It's time to take back control of your life." Their words, simple yet sincere, felt like a lifeline. For so long, Grace had believed she had to face every challenge alone, that admitting she needed help was a sign of failure. But in the warmth of her family's home, she realized she had been wrong. The next morning, Grace awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside the window of her childhood bedroom. The room remained just as she had left it many years ago, from the neatly arranged bookshelves to the framed college graduation photos. She sat up slowly, the events of the previous night rushing back with sharp pain, but alongside the pain was a newfound sense of purpose. She had let Ethan control her life for far too long, diminishing her confidence and isolating her from those who loved her. That would end today. Grace chose a simple blouse and slacks from her old wardrobe and made her way downstairs. Her parents were waiting in the kitchen, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. They greeted her with smiles, their warmth reinforcing the strength of her resolve. At breakfast, Benjamin laid out a plan. "I'll connect you with our lawyer," he said, his tone resolute. "She's handled cases like this before, and we won't let Ethan get away with this." Grace nodded, grateful for his support. "I also need to get back to work," she said. "I've been distracted for too long. It's time to refocus." Evelyn placed a hand on her shoulder, gently comforting her. "Take it one step at a time, Grace. You don't have to rebuild everything overnight." The rest of the day was filled with phone calls and paperwork. She contacted a divorce lawyer her father had recommended, a sharp woman named Victoria Hayes. They scheduled a meeting for the following morning to discuss the details of her case. That evening, as Grace sat with her parents in the living room, a wave of guilt washed over her. She thought about the years she had spent distancing herself from them, prioritizing a man who had done nothing but drag her down. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, her voice choked with emotion. "For shutting you out, for not listening when you tried to warn me." Evelyn moved closer, sitting beside her and wrapping her arms around her. "You don't need to apologize, Grace. You did what you thought was right at the time. What matters is that you're here now." Benjamin nodded from his chair, his expression softening, replacing the worry with encouragement. "You've always been strong, Grace. Stronger than you think. And now you're taking your strength back." Their words empowered her, filling her with a determination she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, Grace allowed herself to hope for a better future, a future where she took control of her own life. The next morning, Grace arrived at Victoria Hayes' office, a sleek, modern space in the heart of the city. Victoria greeted her with a firm handshake and a confident smile. "Let's get started," Victoria said, motioning for Grace to sit. "Tell me everything." Grace recounted her marriage to Ethan. Victoria listened attentively, taking notes on every detail. When she finished, Victoria leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "You have a strong case," Victoria said. "We'll gather evidence of financial and emotional abuse and any other misconduct from Ethan. He may fight us, but I assure you we'll be well prepared." Grace nodded, a wave of relief sweeping over her. For the first time since her marriage began to unravel, she felt as if she had an ally, someone who believed in her and was ready to fight for her. In the following days, Grace began to take small but significant steps to reclaim her life. She reconnected with Sophia, who welcomed her back with open arms, and started reaching out to colleagues she had distanced herself from long ago. She poured herself into her work, rediscovering the passion that had once driven her. But the road ahead would not be easy. Ethan would not let go easily, and Grace knew that the weeks to come would be filled with challenges. Yet, as she stood in her parents' living room one evening, gazing out at the distant city lights, she knew she was ready. She could feel the clarity she hadn't experienced in years. She was no longer merely existing. She was beginning to take control of her life, one step at a time, one piece at a time. And for the first time in a long while, Grace felt truly alive again. Grace sat at her desk in the office, her fingers lightly tapping on the polished wooden surface. Sunlight streamed through the large window, but it did little to ease the tension she felt inside. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of legal meetings, rekindling old friendships, and re-establishing her presence at work. Despite some progress, the shadow of her marriage still loomed over her. She knew Ethan would not let her go quietly, and when he came, she had to be ready. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. The screen displayed Ethan's name, and her stomach tightened. She stared at the screen for a moment, hesitating whether to answer. Finally, taking a deep breath, she swiped the screen to accept the call. Grace, Ethan's voice, was sharp, lacking the charm it once had. "We need to talk." "There's nothing left to say," she replied calmly, though her heart raced. "Oh, I think there is," he cut in, his voice tinged with anger. "You think you can just walk away from this marriage and take everything with you? You're out of your mind." Grace tightened her grip on the phone. "I'm not taking anything that doesn't belong to me, Ethan. You've used me for years, and now it's over. If you have anything to say, contact my lawyer." "No," he roared. "I won't let a lawyer dictate my life. Meet me tonight. You owe me that." Grace hesitated, every instinct telling her to refuse, but a part of her wanted to face him, to confront him once and for all. "All right," she said finally, "but we'll meet in a public place." They agreed to meet at a cafe near downtown. Grace arrived early, choosing a table by the window, where she could watch the street outside. Her heart pounded as she waited, but she reassured herself, reminding herself of all she had already overcome. When Ethan arrived, he still looked the part of a professional, but his eyes betrayed his fury. He sat across from her, his hands clasped on the table as if trying to steady himself. "This isn't how things were supposed to go," he said, his tone calm but laced with frustration. "We're supposed to be a team." "A team?" Grace repeated, incredulous. "You spent our entire marriage sabotaging me, isolating me, taking everything from me. That's not a team, Ethan. That's control." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I did what I had to do to keep us afloat. You had everything handed to you, while I worked my ass off to get what I have. And you think that excuses everything I've done? You've exploited me, Ethan," she shot back, her voice firm. "My money, my relationships, my reputation, and it's still not enough for you." Ethan's composure began to crack, his voice rising. "You're crazy. I built this life for us while you were busy playing hero in your corporate world. You'd be nothing without me." Grace's hands trembled beneath the table, but she refused to let him see her fear. She stared him down, her voice unwavering. "You're wrong, Ethan. I knew who I was before I met you, and I will continue to be that person long after you're gone. You do not define me." Ethan's face darkened, and for a moment, Grace thought he might strike her. But instead, he leaned back in his chair, a bitter smile curling on his lips. "You'll regret this, Grace. You think you're untouchable? You're not invincible. I'll destroy you." "Go ahead." She stood up, her voice resolute. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." Without waiting for a response, Grace turned and walked out of the cafe, her heart pounding. She knew Ethan wouldn't give up easily, but for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. That evening, Grace sat in Victoria Hayes' office, recounting her confrontation with Ethan. Victoria listened attentively, her sharp eyes narrowing as Grace described Ethan's threats. "We need to document everything," Victoria said, her voice calm and steady. Victoria jotted notes. In her leather-bound notebook, her gaze focused on the words she was writing. "Every conversation, every incident. If he does anything, we'll be ready," she continued, her tone resolute. Grace nodded, feeling grateful for Victoria's unwavering support throughout the past few weeks. The lawyer had become her anchor, guiding her through the legal maze with meticulous attention and empathy. "Do you think he'll actually follow through on his threats?" Grace asked, her voice softer than usual. Victoria looked up, her expression serious. "People like Ethan can't stand losing control. He'll try to intimidate you, maybe even spin the story to portray himself as the victim. But we have the truth on our side, and we'll use it," Victoria replied. Grace left the office with a renewed sense of determination. She was no longer the woman who had endured years of Ethan's abuse. She was stronger, more resolute, and no longer allowing him to control her life. The following days were tense as Grace couldn't ignore the smear campaign Ethan had launched. He spread rumors about her, claiming she had abandoned him, selfish and ungrateful. Grace overheard whispers, saw the judgmental glances as she entered meetings or attended events. Though she refused to let them sway her. She focused on her work and the people who truly mattered. Sophia became a steadfast pillar in her life, always ready to offer support. Her family was there for her, their home a refuge whenever the pressure became overwhelming. One afternoon, Grace received an email from Victoria, accompanied by a file containing evidence of Ethan's financial fraud. These documents showed that he had withdrawn money from their accounts to fund his personal projects. Victoria had also uncovered letters that proved he had manipulated their mutual friends and colleagues. Grace stared at the files, a mixture of anger and relief flooding over her. This was the proof she needed, not just for the divorce, but for herself. It validated everything she had endured, every moment when she had questioned her own reality. As the lawsuit against Ethan began to take shape, Grace felt a shift within herself. She was no longer the victim, no longer the woman who silently endured years of emotional abuse. She was reclaiming her story, her power, her life. The final confrontation with Ethan was drawing nearer, but Grace knew she was ready. She had her family, her friends, her legal team, and most importantly, herself. For the first time in years, she felt like the woman she was meant to be, strong, confident, and unafraid. The courthouse stood before her, a monumental structure of stone and glass, its towering facade a symbol of justice and closure. Grace stood at the entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent the past weeks preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, recounting the years of manipulation, and readying herself for the inevitable battle. Today marked the beginning of the final phase, the divorce trial. Her parents stood on either side of her, their presence a steady source of comfort. Evelyn squeezed her hand, giving it a light reassuring press as if to say, "You've got this, Grace. Be strong." Benjamin nodded, his face solemn, but his gaze softened as he looked into his daughter's eyes. "This is the end for him. You've won by taking your life back." Grace nodded, drawing strength from their words. She took a deep breath and stepped through the heavy door, the sound of her heels echoing on the polished floor. Victoria Hayes was waiting for her inside, a calm light amid the storm. Victoria greeted her, her voice professional, yet warm. "Are you ready?" "Yes," Grace replied, her voice firm despite the fluttering butterflies in her stomach. "I'm ready." As they entered the courtroom, Grace saw Ethan seated at the defendant's table. He was still impeccably dressed, as always, but his posture was tense, his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. For a moment, their gazes met. Grace saw the man who had once captivated her. But that image quickly faded, replaced by the reality of who he had become, or perhaps, who he had always been. The trial began with opening statements, each side presenting their case. Victoria spoke with precision and confidence, presenting evidence of Ethan's financial misconduct, emotional abuse, and manipulation. Grace quietly observed as her attorney meticulously laid bare each piece of evidence, each fact that pierced through the facade Ethan had so carefully built. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he crafted a picture of himself as the victim. He claimed that Grace had neglected their marriage, prioritized her career over their relationship, and left him without warning. His voice was calm, almost pleading as he tried to shape his narrative. A wave of anger rose within Grace, but she maintained her composure. He knew this was his final attempt to control the story, to cast himself as the aggrieved party, but she also knew that the truth was on her side. When it was her turn to testify, Grace took a deep breath and stepped to the stand. She recounted the years of silent criticism, being isolated from friends and family, financially exploited, and the explosive confrontation at the restaurant. Her voice was steady, though the memories she shared had once made her feel small and powerless. "I stayed because I believed things would get better," she said, her tone resolute yet tinged with emotion. "I thought if I tried harder, if I gave more, this marriage could be saved. But I realized that no amount of effort can change someone who doesn't want to change. I deserve better, and today, I take the first step toward building the life I deserve." The courtroom fell silent as Grace finished speaking. Even Ethan, who had spent much of the trial taking notes or glaring at Victoria, seemed taken aback. The judge called for a recess and stated that a ruling would be made the following week. As Grace left the courtroom, an unusual sense of peace settled over her. The outcome was no longer in her hands, but she knew she had done everything she could. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. The week passed in a blur. Grace threw herself into her work, finding solace in the projects she had once enjoyed. She spent evenings with her family, savoring simple meals and rediscovering the warmth of their love. Sophia returned to being a familiar part of her life, their conversations filled with laughter and the comfort of long-standing friendship. On the day of the ruling, Grace returned to the courthouse, with Victoria and her parents by her side. The judge's decision was swift and decisive. Grace would retain full ownership of their assets, including her stake in the family business. Ethan's demands were dismissed, and he was ordered to repay part of the money he had taken. The weight of the decision hit Grace like a wave, and as the judge's words echoed in her mind, relief, affirmation, and a sense of closure washed over her. She had won, not just in the legal battle, but in reclaiming her freedom. Outside the courthouse, the sun shone brightly, a stark contrast to the storm that had engulfed her life for so long. Her parents enveloped her in a tight embrace, pride clear in their eyes. "You did it," Evelyn said, tears glistening in her eyes. "You've taken your life back." Benjamin nodded, his gaze softening as he looked into his daughter's eyes. "This is just the beginning, Grace. You have an entire future ahead of you." Grace smiled, her heart swelling with hope. For the first time in many years, the horizon before her felt wide open, filled with possibilities. In the weeks that followed, Grace began rebuilding her life, step by step. She reconnected with colleagues she had distanced herself from, strengthening both her professional network and personal relationships. At work, she led a new initiative focused on mentoring young professionals from underrepresented backgrounds, transforming her experiences into something meaningful. She also established a charity to support women who had suffered emotional and financial abuse. The organization was quickly embraced, with Grace sharing her story in interviews and presentations. Her pain and resilience resonated with others, inspiring them to find their own strength. Yet, Grace never forgot the journey that had brought her to this point, the pain, the betrayal, and the moments of doubt. What had shaped her, but no longer defined her? She was no longer the woman who dimmed her own light to let others shine. She was stronger, wiser, and unrepentant for being true to herself. One evening, as Grace sat on the balcony of her apartment, gazing out at the city's skyline, she felt a peace she had never known before. The past was behind her, and the future unfolded before her like an uncharted map. She raised her glass, silently offering a toast to the night sky, a gesture honoring her journey. She had faced the storms and emerged stronger. Now, it was time to embrace the life she truly deserved. Leaning against the balcony railing, the cool night breeze brushed against her skin. The city stretched before her, a sea of lights and vibrant energy, brimming with possibilities. For years, she had felt trapped, weighed down by the responsibilities of her marriage and the expectations placed upon her. But now, she stood at the threshold of a new chapter, and her life was finally her own. The charity she had founded was flourishing, with a flood of emails each day from women sharing their stories, seeking advice, and expressing gratitude for the resources her team provided. Each message was a reminder of why she chose this path. Her pain, once a source of shame, had become a beacon of hope for others. That evening, she hosted an event to celebrate the success of the foundation. Her parents, Sophia, and close supporters would be there, along with the women whose lives had been transformed by the foundation's programs. Grace wanted the evening to be more than just a celebration. It was a declaration of her resilience, a moment to honor the strength of every woman who had reclaimed control of her life. The event was held at Larda, a stunning rooftop venue adorned with lush greenery and twinkling lights that resembled stars. Guests arrived in elegant attire, their conversations blending seamlessly with the soothing melodies of a jazz band. Grace greeted each guest with a warm smile, confidence radiating from every step she took through the crowd. She felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. Turning around, she saw Sophia smiling at her, a champagne glass in hand. "You did it, Grace," Sophia said, her eyes sweeping over the beautifully decorated space. "It's incredible." Grace chuckled, clinking her glass with Sophia's. "It's not just me. Everyone here has played a part. This foundation wouldn't exist without the support of people like you." Sophia's expression softened. "You can't imagine how happy I am to see you like this, strong, happy, free. I've missed this version of you." Grace smiled, Sophia's words settling deep in her heart. For so long she had felt like a shadow, but now she was rediscovering the woman she had always been. "I've missed her too," she admitted. The evening unfolded smoothly, with guests mingling, sharing stories, and connecting. Grace took the stage at one point. Her voice was steady as she thanked everyone for their support and spoke about the Foundation's mission. She shared a part of her journey, her vulnerability resonating in the room. When she finished, the applause was thunderous, a wave of support washing over her. As the night wore on, Grace stood on the rooftop, gazing at the sparkling horizon. She heard footsteps from behind and turned to find her mother approaching, a gentle smile on her face. "You're amazing," Evelyn said, stepping up beside her daughter. "Your father and I couldn't be prouder." Grace felt a lump in her throat. "Thank you, Mom, for everything. For always standing by me, even when I wasn't easy." Evelyn took her daughter's hand, her grip firm yet tender. "You've always been strong, Grace, even when you couldn't see it. Watching you reclaim your life is one of the greatest joys of mine." Grace nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you and Dad. I felt lost for so long, but you never gave up on me." Evelyn smiled, her eyes lighting up. "That's the purpose of family, and now you're building a new one. A community of women who see their strength reflected in you. That's something to be proud of." Grace leaned her head on her mother's shoulder as they both gazed at the city in peaceful silence. The days that followed were filled with a busy energy. Grace's foundation continued to grow, and her career flourished as she faced new challenges, all while carrying a deeper sense of purpose. She began traveling, exploring cultures and cuisines she had long dreamed of experiencing. Each journey brought new inspiration, fresh ideas for the foundation, and a renewed perspective on life, deepening her appreciation for her own resilience. In Morocco, she marveled at the vibrant markets and shared meals with local women who spoke of their victories and struggles. In Japan, she immersed herself in tranquil arts, finding peace in serene gardens and the ritual of tea. Each journey was a step forward in her healing, a celebration of the life she was reclaiming. Back home, Grace's apartment had transformed into a warm, creative sanctuary. The walls were adorned with photographs and souvenirs from her travels, each item a reminder of the path she had walked. The woman she saw in the mirror each morning was no longer haunted by self-doubt. She was strong, confident, and true to herself, with no regrets. One evening, as Grace sat at her desk reviewing the plans for the next initiative of the foundation, she received an email from Sophia. The subject line read, "Look at this girl." Curious, Grace opened it and found a link to an article. The headline read, "From Survivor to Leader, Grace Morgan on Rebuilding a Strong, Purpose-Driven Life." The article shared Grace's journey, her work with the foundation, and her commitment to empowering women. As she finished reading, Grace felt a swell of pride rise within her, not because of the recognition, but because of the impact she was making. Her story was no longer about pain, it was a source of hope. That evening, Grace stepped out onto the balcony, a glass of wine in her hand. The city lights sparkled like thousands of little promises, each light a testament to the endless possibilities ahead. She thought about the woman she had been when she first met Ethan, bright-eyed, filled with hope but still unsure of her. She thought about the years gone by, the years when she had dimmed her own light so that others could shine. And then she thought about the woman she was now, strong, independent, and unafraid to take up space in this world. Grace raised her glass to the horizon, a quiet gesture honoring the journey that had brought her here. "To new beginnings," she whispered, her voice soft yet resolute. As she took a sip of her wine, she felt the peace settle deep within her. The scars of her past would always be there, but they no longer defined her. She was free, free to live, to love, to dream, and she was only just beginning. For years, Grace's identity as a black billionaire had been scrutinized and challenged by those closest to her, but tonight marked a turning point. The husband who once captivated her with charm and ambition had revealed himself to be far more calculating than she could have ever imagined. Yet, in that moment, covered in shards of chocolate and shattered pride, Grace found a clarity that had eluded her for so long. This wasn't just a story about a cake or a bill left unpaid. It was a mirror held up to the complexities of human relationships, how power, respect, and value intertwine in ways that can either uplift or destroy. What comes next for Grace? A journey of reclaiming her strength, her voice, and her identity. This dramatic fallout serves as a poignant reminder that sometimes the most valuable lessons emerge from the moments that break us. If this story left you wanting more insights into human resilience, dramatic turns, and the power of self-discovery, you're in the right place. Stick around, subscribe, and prepare to uncover more stories that challenge, inspire, and push the boundaries of what we think we know about ourselves and others. Your next chapter is waiting. Will you dare to turn the page? Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any mistakes, kindly overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.